Welcome everyone. We're going to get started here with kind of our first big theme of the semester. The first couple lectures, we've kind of hit a lot of civilizations very quickly. The Sumerians, um, the Babylonians, of course, Hammurabi's Code, and then the Hittites very briefly as well. What we're going to do now is begin to talk about the period after the Dark Age, starting at around 1100 BC. And as I mentioned last lecture, there were four kind of major civilizations that kind of developed in the Middle East after the Dark Age, right? The Hebrews, the Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians, and the Persians. And so we're going to spend a couple lectures here talking about the ancient Hebrews. And I say this is kind of the first big theme. And when I say something is a theme, that should get your attention, because if something is a big theme, it's not just going to possibly be part of a quiz question. This could be an entire essay topic, right? And it's something we're going to spend a bit of time on talking about in the first part of the semester. And so it's the story of the ancient Hebrew people. You know, you cannot understand, again, the Middle East today if you don't know the history of the Jewish people, the ancient state of Israel, going back to, again, about 1100 BC. And so it's a lot of things we're going to talk about here. So come along, let me start by kind of setting things up for you. And so this is kind of the setup, right? And before we get into the key words and all the key parts of the stories, what are we doing? What is the objective of this big theme? There are three primary points that I want you to understand about the ancient Hebrew people. I want you to know about their political history. In other words, their rulers, their governmental system, their kings. There are going to be three kings you need to know. Their cultural history, right? And what I mean by that, that's going to be probably in the next video here, and that's going to be the cultural history, the religion, the impact of the religion, their way of life, their diet, the holidays, right? To get in a sense of what the Jewish culture is about. It's really a remarkable story. You know, the fact that the Jewish culture is still around today after thousands on top of thousands of years, despite multiple attempts to wipe out the entire culture, is really remarkable. And the Jewish people are very small. I mean, to give you perspective, there are only less than 20 million Jewish people in the world today. Just to give you perspective on that, there's about 2 billion Christians, about 1.5 billion Muslims in the world today. Only about 20 million, less than that, Jewish people in the world today. And yet they manage to keep their history going from generation to generation. And there's a reason for that. And when we talk about the cultural history, you'll get that. And so that's, I think, a really interesting topic to discuss. So we'll spend a lot of time on that. That's something I never get a chance to do in my other history courses, but in the Middle East class, I do have some time to get into that. And then the last thing you're going to need to know are the impact other civilizations had on the Hebrews, right? And what in the antiquity period specifically. So again, we're still talking about the antiquity period. We're talking about the Hebrews now. We're going to talk about them again later in the semester. It's one of the big topics early in the semester, and it's one of the big topics at the end of the semester. A lot of the middle of the semester, we won't be talking about them as much, but here they're very important. Okay, so those are the big three things you want to know: the political history, the cultural history, the impacts other civilizations had on the Hebrews. In this particular lecture right now, we're going to focus more on the political history, and then we'll get to the cultural history and these other points as we go on through some other lectures. So I hope all that's clear. That's kind of the big setup of what we're going to be doing. All right, so here are a couple of the first set of keywords about the political history of the ancient Hebrews and a couple of maps. Don't worry about this map over here. We're just going to kind of use this other map right over here. And what we're talking about is the state of the civilization of the ancient Hebrews, whose capital was, of course, the city of Jerusalem. And before I even get into any of the history and any of these key words, here's Jerusalem. I know it's small, but it's right kind of there in the center, and I'll explain the two colors later on this map. This is actually a pretty important point, that this is the capital of the ancient state of the Hebrews. And in 2018, during the Trump administration, the United States recognized today that Jerusalem is the capital of the Hebrew people, the Jewish people today in Israel. Other presidents have talked about this for a long time. No one had ever done it. The United States also, during the Trump administration, moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Not a lot of people in the Middle East were happy about this, by the way. It was very popular, of course, in Israel, but this is something that many presidents have talked about but never happened. Why is that significant? Well, again, this stuff, if you look at the dates here, is going back thousands of years. And this is all part of maintaining that identity of the Jewish people. This is the capital of the Jewish people back in 1000 BC, and it's the capital of the Jewish people in 2000 BC, 2000 AD and beyond, right? Just to give you an idea, 2020 or whatever, 2018 is when the United States recognized this as their capital. So Israel, of course, has always said it's their capital, but other countries in the world did not want to acknowledge it until, again, 2018. So anyways, it's an interesting side point, but I think important to understand the current modern Middle East. And again, some of you may be familiar with that, some may not, depends how closely you cover it. All right, so here are these key words, and these key words have to do with the political history of the Hebrews dating back to around 1100 BC. And the first thing I want you to know about the political history is that the Hebrew people were initially an oligarchy. What does that mean, oligarchy? It means rule of a few. And this oligarchy was when wasn't a united kingdom, but instead both these areas you see here, and this is really small. I mean, to give you an idea, this is actually what you see colored here is actually bigger than what is modern day Israel if you look at a map. And this is all still smaller than the state of New Jersey. So we're not talking about a massive piece of real estate here. But it was divided up into 12 tribes. And these 12 tribes were ruled by judges. And that's the period from about 1100 to 1020 BC. And so that's why we call it an oligarchy, rule of a few, as opposed to a monarchy, rule of one king, right? And so that was the initial rulership system in the land of the ancient Hebrews. Until we get to about 1020 BC, when there was a man named Saul who united the 12 tribes and created a kingdom. And from around circa 1020 BC to about the year 1000 BC, he is your first king of the united Hebrew people. Now, this is really interesting because this gets us into a lot of talk about the Bible. And you see these names, Saul, David, Philistines, like, oh, I've seen these names before. They're in the Bible. Is this where we get our history of the ancient Hebrews? And the answer is a lot of it is yes. And people go, well, can you really use the Bible as history? And the answer to that is this. Look, the Bible is a primary source, but you can't use it blindly. You can't use it by itself. To really look and understand the Bible, you have to also do archaeological digs. I've been to Israel many, many times. I've gone to many archaeological sites there. Maybe in another lecture, I'll show you some images of some of them. They're just absolutely remarkable. And when you look at these archaeological digs and these archaeological work that has been done in Israel, it is amazing how much of the archaeological work confirms what's in the Bible. Where it does get a little bit tricky is the timing of it, because this is the issue. If you date things, if you look at this line I'm drawing up here as a timeline, right? And let's say I date something to the year 1000 BC. I'm doing carbon dating, if you're not familiar with that, right? And I date something to the year 1000 BC, during the time of King David, who I'll talk about here in a second. And you have King David ruled in 1000 BC, and the Bible says King David did X, Y, and Z, and I do archaeological work, and I find those things dated back to 1000 BC. It means that what's in the Bible is historically accurate. But this is the problem. If I date something to 1000 BC, when you carbon date things, they're never exact. There's always a plus minus. So if I find something that the Bible talks about during the kingdom of David or the kingdom of Saul or the kingdom of Solomon, who we'll talk about, if I find it in archaeological digs, it doesn't necessarily mean it happened during their time period. It could have, it could not have happened. It all depends on which archaeologist you talk to. And so a lot of the archaeological digs confirm things that are in the Bible to the exact date of when they are in the Bible. Other things say, no, this happened earlier or later, which is significant if that's true, because it changes the history of the time period. So it's not an exact science, but I will say it is remarkable how many things that are in the Bible archaeology has proven to be true. So I hope that's clear. I'm going to try to find a video to show you on some of this as well, some archaeological history of this land, because it's just so fascinating. Anyways, so that's all you really need to know about King Saul. King Saul dies. He's going to be replaced by King David. King David is probably the most famous king of the ancient Hebrews. In biblical writings, he's described as a great warrior, as a musician, as a poet, someone who liked the ladies, and King David, of course, his most famous story is the story of David and Goliath. And almost everyone's heard the story of David and Goliath, right? What is that story? Well, the story of David and Goliath is the story of David as a little boy fighting this mighty giant, killing him with a slingshot, and by doing that, he defeats this great enemy of his himself, and defeats Goliath. David and Goliath, very famous story. So was there an actual giant? Well, one of the things that we have is next to the kingdom of the Hebrews, there's another civilization known as the Philistines. I put their word there, and again, it's really small on the map here, I know. The Philistines, that's why I wrote it for you as a key word, were an enemy of the Hebrews. And David probably defeated the Philistines. So the story of David and Goliath may not be a literal story of David slaying an actual giant. Instead, it could have been a story of David defeating the Philistines. There's a lot of things, I just got through saying, can you use the Old Testament to study history? And to some degree you can. But there's also the issue of everything in the Old Testament, anything in the Bible, can you just look at it exactly verbatim, or are there interpretations to it that make more sense? Look, read Genesis and all the early writings in the Bible, and talks about how God created everything in 7 days. And you go, well, that's not possible, I know, or 6 days, excuse me. God created everything in 6 days, 7 day he rested. I said, I know it took billions of years for the earth to be created. The Bible must be wrong. And then I tell people, well, okay, how long is a day? And people go 24 hours. And then I say, how long is a day for God? And people look at me like, what? How long is a day for God? Well, a day for God is as long as he wants it to be. So, can you do it in 6 days? Sure. And, the Big Bang. The Big Bang is, people say, can you be a scientist and be a religious person, believe in the Big Bang? And the answer is absolutely yes, because you could say the Big Bang is God's way of creation. So there's interesting ways to think about this stuff. And this is stuff I always prefer to do in class, in person, to have these discussions with students, because it's really fascinating. But at least on your own, you can think about it. And so anyways, King David defeats the Philistines, makes the Hebrew kingdom very strong, and he's a dominant force, obviously, in ancient Hebrew civilization. All right, excuse me. Sneeze there. So anyways, that's the role of King David until he dies around 980 BC. These are all circa dates, obviously. When he dies, he's going to be replaced by his son. Who is his son? Well, his son is Solomon. And so here's our next set of keywords. You're going to want to get all these down, and we're going to talk about Solomon, because Solomon, who comes in around the year, again, a little bit after about 970 BC, or circa 970 BC, he's going to, remember, right after David, so 980, 970, again, a lot of the dates aren't exact, and I didn't need you to memorize exact dates, as long as you could put circa 1000 BC for all this, and I'm going to be happy, honestly, guys. But you do need the chronology. That is important. You can't tell me Solomon came before Saul. As long as you get the right order, if you're in the ballpark with the dates, I'm happy. So anyway, Solomon, he's most famous for what we call Solomon's Temple. And I'm going to show you some images of this. This is really cool. But for those of you who are not familiar, why is Solomon's Temple important? Well, Solomon's Temple is what houses the Ark of the Covenant. So these are all the key words you're getting down, of course, as I'm talking about this. What is the Ark of the Covenant? Well, the Ark of the Covenant, for those of you who've never seen the original Indiana Jones movie, and I'm always shocked how many of my students have never seen the Indiana Jones movie. You've been on the ride in Disneyland with a big boulder coming down. If you've never seen the original Indiana Jones movie, go see it. It's fun. It's good. But anyways, the whole story is that's what houses the Ten Commandments. So Solomon builds this magnificent temple in Jerusalem, right? And the question is that temple around today? What's the story about that temple? So go ahead, get the rest of these terms down. Wailing Wall, Dome of the Rock, Kingdom of Israel, Assyrians, Kingdom of Judah. Go ahead, write all that down. If you need a pause, pause, write it down, and then I'm going to move on. I'm going to continue to tell the story of Solomon, and I'll explain what these other terms are for when we get to them. All right, so I'm going to move on. If you haven't finished, pause, get the rest of the words, and we're going to move on and talk about Solomon's temple by showing some images. All right, so here we go. This is a model of Solomon's temple. If you go to Jerusalem today, Solomon's temple is not there. But this is a model of what Solomon's temple may have looked like, right? According to the documents we have. So if you go to Jerusalem today, that temple is gone. Jewish people are going to build a temple there. That temple will be destroyed. At the same spot, the Jewish people will build a second temple. The second temple will later be destroyed. And we'll talk about the destruction of the temples when we get to that on both situations. But it's built, the initial one is built during the time of Solomon. So what's there today? Well, the only thing left there today is the outer wall that surrounded the second temple. Now, this outer wall that surrounds the second temple is called the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall, also known as the Kotel, right? Kotel. I want you to know that word. So it's the Wailing Wall. That's what we usually call it in Hebrew. It's called the Kotel. That's actually what it's called. The Kotel. Most people don't know that because it's called the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall. And maybe you recognize this image here, right? And this is a very famous site. It is the most holiest site of Judaism, right? It is the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, but I also want you to know it referred to as the Kotel. And it doesn't look that big, but let me go to our next image here again. So this is what it looks like if you go visit it in person. I've been there several times. And this is our model again. Now, if you notice, this model is different because you see all of these buildings, they weren't in the previous image, right? If you go back and look, the previous image, those models weren't, these buildings weren't there. So what had happened, here's the Wailing Wall, where you see these lights here, right? This little, that you could go and see. If you go visit, you walk down here, you see Wailing Wall. Then there are buildings. These buildings were built right next to the Wailing Wall as other civilizations moved into Jerusalem. Many civilizations are going to live there. And some of these buildings are hundreds, if not thousands of years old, but they're still younger than the Wailing Wall, to give you some perspective. Anyway, so if you go to Israel today, you could go visit the Wailing Wall. Anyone can go to the Wailing Wall. You don't have to be Jewish, Christian, Muslim, atheist, whatever you want. Anybody can go to the Wailing Wall. Everyone's free to visit there. It's open to everybody. But that's the only part you could see until about the 1970s, because around the 1970s, what the Israeli government did is very carefully excavated between the ancient Wailing Wall and these modern buildings. There isn't much room, but if you want today, you could take a tour through the rest of the Wailing Wall. So instead of just seeing that little area I showed you in the picture before, you could walk through, and this is a picture I took when I was doing this, the rest of the Wailing Wall. Guys, this is just stunning when you do this in person. This is so cool. That's why I always tell people study history, because if you get a chance to travel somewhere, you really have meaning to these things. And you're walking down this road that goes on in between these ancient buildings and more ancient Wailing Wall. And it's just a remarkable kind of feeling to be able to go through and see this and feel through all this and touch it. It's just absolutely amazing. And as you walk down it, there's actually a point where you get to this closest spot to where the Ark of the Covenant once was. So if you kind of imagine this is the wall, and then, here would be Solomon's temple over there further down. So again, it's kind of, hopefully you could visualize it. So that's pretty cool, right? And so that's the Wailing Wall and all part of Solomon's temple. That's the only thing that's left is the outer wall. The temple itself is gone. And this is a close-up of the wall today, and all these pieces of paper. What are all those pieces of paper? Those are notes and prayers to God, and you can see there. They do divide it up, male, female, so anybody can go there, but there's a section for men and a section for women, and I think it was around 2016 or so, they did create a section, a co-ed section, where men and women can go to the wall together on certain days, but generally men on one side, women on the other side. All right. Now, what's there today? So if you go to where Solomon's temple was, right on top of Solomon's temple today is this building. It's called the Dome of the Rock. What is the Dome of the Rock? Well, we'll talk about this again later in the semester when we talk about the rise of Islam. Because around the 600s AD, the Islamic faith will take control of Jerusalem. And when they do, one of the Islamic dynasties will build this Dome of the Rock, a Muslim holy site right on top of where Solomon's temple once stood. So I want you to think about this. Do you think this might create some conflict in the region? You're all probably thinking, well, duh, yeah, of course. Now this is not unique to a Muslim site being built on what was once a Jewish site. Civilizations do this all the time. One civilization will build on top of another. But this creates a lot of conflict. And this sometimes, if you heard the term Temple Mount, this is what you talk about, the Temple Mount. And, sometimes this creates conflict, physical conflicts, because Jewish people want to go there and say, hey, we want to pray here. This is a holiest site. This is, the site where Abraham was about to sacrifice his son, and God, was intervened and stopped him. This is the site of Solomon's temple. And then, Muslims say, well, this is the site where, we believe Muhammad's soul ascended to heaven, and so forth. Muhammad himself personally never went to Jerusalem, but this is what Muslims believe. And so this creates a conflict right there. And so this has led to a lot of conflicts over this land. So it's just kind of an interesting point that the Dome of the Rock is built right on top of where Solomon's temple stood. So anyways, that's what's there today. All right. So back to our map, and then this one's a little bigger, so hopefully you can see it a little better. I try to make it a little bigger here. And so Solomon continues to rule until he finally dies. When Solomon dies, what happens? When Solomon dies, the kingdom of the Hebrews divides into two parts, the kingdom of Israel in the north, the kingdom of Judah in the south. And it's that old saying, united we stand, divided we fall. And sure enough, the kingdom of Israel in the north will be conquered by a group of people known as the Assyrians, who we're going to do a lecture on, a little bit of a lecture on. And the kingdom of Judah in the south will be conquered by the Babylonians, the Neo-Babylonians to be precise. It'll be the Neo-Babylonians who destroy Solomon's temple, the first temple. I'll talk about how the second temple's built and what happens to that in other lectures. But you do need to know that the kingdom of Israel in the north is conquered by the Assyrians. The kingdom of Judah in the south is conquered by the Babylonians. And those key words before, so you should have that down. Why does that matter? Well, again, to give you perspective, by the time both the kingdoms are conquered, you're around the year 900 BC, which means from about the year 900 BC until 1948 AD, right? That's a long time. The Jewish people will not have self-autonomy over their land, or at least full self-autonomy over the entire land. There will be a Jewish presence there. There will be Jewish people living in this land, but other civilizations will control it, will occupy this land. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Ottomans, the Umayyads, and the Abbasids before the Ottomans, the British, a lot of civilizations will control this land. And it won't be till 1948 until the Jewish people have self-autonomy over this land. So remember why I said, why do you need to understand this stuff to understand modern history of the Middle East? How can you understand the significance, for example, of the state of Israel today if you don't understand that there's a story that goes back 3,000 years? And the answer is you don't. So the fact that there are courses, college campuses that teach an entire history of the Middle East class and ignore this is obviously problematic. You cannot have a full picture of things. You really need to know the long history. So anyways, that's the political history up to 900 BC, right? We're not done because we still need to talk about what other civilizations do. We'll talk about the Assyrians, talk about the Babylonians in more detail, talk about what happens when Rome moves into the area. So we are going to cover more of this stuff. But for now, that covers the big political history I want you to know. So what's next? And what is next is the cultural history of the Hebrews. And, the political history is really important. It's very significant. You definitely need to know that. The cultural history is a lot of fun. I think it's fun. I think it's interesting. It's one of those topics you can spend a whole lifetime studying Judaism, just like you can spend a whole lifetime studying Christianity or Islam or any other religion, of course. But it's so old, Judaism. It just predates all these other religions by such a long period. And it's just a fascinating culture to study. And so we'll definitely do that, and we'll cover all the cultural history in our next lecture. All right, thank you guys. If you have any questions, as always, let me know.